Okay, are we going? Are we ready? So, welcome to Echoes of Liberty, commemorating the Semiquincentennial of 1774. So, in honor of Independence Day, we will look at the importance of this year of 1774 and its impact on the Revolutionary War. So, my name is Dr. Jennifer Bridges, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's event. I am an associate professor of history for the TCC Connect campus, and I am honored to present our speakers for this wonderful and informative talk. So our speakers are going to be looking at the year of 1774 in a chronological fashion and explaining some of the most relevant events that led us as a country closer to the American Revolution. So there's my lovely photo, which again, should have put that on there while I was talking, but okay. Here's our speakers for today. So I'm going to go ahead and give introductions for our speakers, and then they will talk and kind of keep it flowing. So I won't break up their talks by introducing them. So our first speaker of the day is Chloe Northrop. She's a professor of history and the department chair for the TCC Connect campus. She received her PhD in history with a minor in art history from the University of North Texas. Her first book, called Fashioning Society in 18th Century British Jamaica, was published earlier this year in the Routledge series in the History of the Americas series. She has served as the guest curator at the Leyland Museum for Mum's the Word on the history of homecoming moms in Cleburne, Texas. She's curated a World War I exhibit and was the project director for Away from Home, American Indian Boarding School Stories this spring at the Trinity River campus at TCC. She is currently working on a monograph on material objects surrounding British naval military celebrities, specifically focusing on Admiral George Rodney. Our next speaker is Dr. Jason Frawley. He has taught face-to-face, online, and honors courses at Tarrant County College since 2005. He earned his PhD from Texas Christian University in 2008 after moving to Texas from his native state of Georgia, where he attended Georgia Southern University for both his bachelor's and his master's degrees. In 2021, he was the recipient of TCC's Chancellor's Award for exemplary teaching. Outside of work, Dr. Frawley enjoys playing guitar and singing, playing video and tabletop games, and spending time with his wonderful wife, Jill, and his 3 growing boys, Joshua, Justin, and James. Our final speaker will be Dr. John Lundberg. He's a professor of history at the TCC Connect campus, and he holds a PhD in U.S. history from TCU. His specialties include 19th century U.S. history, Texas history, slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. So we're very excited to have these wonderful, wonderful speakers to talk to you today about 1774. So Dr. Northrop is going to get us started.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bridges. And I am, here we go, taking control. Let's hope we switch sides. We did practice this, everyone, I promise. You know, that's just
There it goes.
Oh, and it's so tiny. That's the problem, that it's so tiny. Can you tell which one is like slide forward? Oh, I think I did it. Okay, thank you all for joining us today. And our story actually really begins a few years before 1774. And it really, we're going to at least begin our story here with the end of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, in 1763. And this marked a turning point for the relationship between Great Britain and the American colonies. And this set off a series of events and policies, of which we are here to discuss some of them here today, that led to the breakdown of a relationship. Sad to always see the breakdown of a once, I would say, at least mutually beneficial relationship. So here's a brief summary of how the aftermath of this war contributed to the deterioration. So how did this happen? Well, for starters, money. It's always money, right? Financial strain and taxation. there was a massive war debt. The 7 Years' War left Britain with significant debt and prompted the government to seek new ways of getting revenue sources. And they're going to turn to the colonies, expecting them to help pay for their defense and the cost of the war. And this made sense to many mainland inhabitants of Britain who believed that the colonies should be helping to pay for their own defense. And this led to the introduction of new taxes, things like the Sugar Act of 1764 and the hated Stamp Act of 1765. And these were deeply unpopular. Deeply unpopular. And they are going to be seen as being levied without colonial consent. Let's see. Are we switching? Let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay, yes, without colonial consent. And this would then violate this idea of no taxation without representation. And as we see this lovely teapot here, this says no Stamp Act. And this is fun because a lot of our story today actually involves tea. So it's kind of all coming together here as well. By the way, you can also buy a replica of this on the Colonial Williamsburg website. So if anyone here is wondering, like, what should I get her for her birthday? I really love this. And I lived in Colonial Williamsburg for a month when I was a graduate student. And I remember seeing that at the gift shop and kind of being like, oh, that's really nice. I'm loving that. But anyways, back to the story here. So they're going to start strictly enforcing trade laws, trying to stop smuggling. And smuggling was incredibly common during this time and trying to ensure colonial compliance with laws that are already in place in the British trade regulations. But the British are going to start tightening down and enforcing these laws. And many of us maybe remember when we were teenagers and maybe like our parents got kind of lax with certain things and then you get in trouble and suddenly like all the rules are getting enforced. And you're like, wait, you've never enforced this before. And they're like, yeah, but it is a rule and now you have to do it, like curfew or something. And you think it's deeply unfair. That's kind of where we're at here. This is then being perceived as an erosion of colonial self-governance, traditional rights, all of these things together. And so this is going to lead to widespread protests and boycotts in the colonies. And things like the Stamp Act Congress in 1765 brings together the colonies to come and talk about and debate these different issues that are being discussed, right? Also, groups like the Sons of Liberty start forming, and they are going to start just demonstrating this growing unity, but also resolve to resist. Now, this is going to lead us to 1770, when there's going to be more kind of tensions, rising tensions, and acts of defiance. So in 1770, British soldiers killed 5 colonists during a confrontation in Boston, which kind of makes many people think that maybe Boston is like the center of some of this unrest. So this is where we're standing in 1770. Tensions are running high, but nothing super duper happened right afterwards. And there was no like widespread things that immediately happened right after the Boston Massacre, at least for our story here. So now it's time to, as they say, spill the tea. I hope I'm saying that correctly here. Actually, my shirt also says spilling the tea since 1773. So I'm on theme here today. So before the American Revolution, tea is not just a beverage in the American colonies. It is a cultural staple. And it's also very much a symbol of British influence, as we see here in these images here. These are British images, but we still see the importance then of the tea table, of the consumption of tea, and that is going to be emulated in the colonies. What can I say? Colonists love their tea. So, tea drinking in the American colonies have been popularized in the 17th and 18th century, largely due to this British influence. And by the 18th century, it is an essential part of daily life for many colonists. Tea is consumed at social gatherings that you have with one another, even in public tea rooms. And this is kind of like the British tea houses that will then be then emulated in the colonies. It's particularly favored by women, who often host these tea parties as part of social events. And it is a really large product consumed in the colonies. By the 1770s, American colonies are importing nearly 1.2 million pounds of tea annually from the British East India Company. And so that is going to mean that basically every colonist is basically having like a cup of tea every single day. So if you're not consuming tea, someone else is like consuming 2 cups then. So it's something that everybody is either doing or it's fairly widespread. And this is really comparable then to consumption in Britain itself, demonstrating that it's very, very widespread popular. And this is really then impactful when we think about the economic implications as well. This is a major part of colonial commerce, and there's a really complex network to make this happen of importers and merchants and retailers and how this all kind of happens. Tea is going to provide enormous revenue for institutions like the British East India Company. And so it is going to be a big part of not only the colonial economy for those who are trading in the colonies itself, but in the mainland itself, in the motherland. So the cost of tea and the cost of purchasing tea and consuming it is affected then by British taxes, British regulations, making this then kind of a contentious economic issue and something that's then debated in the colonies itself. Mary Beth Norton's new book on 1774, which Dr. Frawley, Dr. Lundberg, and I all kind of read and perused to think about this talk today, talked about that this is such, I mean, the first, I say, third of the book is all about tea and talking about how it's smuggled, talking about how it's debated in the colonies, and also that it's not a unified approach to how the colonists should look at tea, should even consume tea. This is really hotly debated, and it is and sometimes very gendered in its debates as well. And debates are quite fierce and definitely vary on colonial location. So this is where we stand when the Tea Act is passed. The Tea Act, the infamous Tea Act, is passed in 1773. This was passed to try to help the struggling British East India Company by allowing it to sell surplus tea directly to the colonies at a reduced rate. So this actually, in many places, would reduce the cost of tea for the colonists. But by doing this, the colonists had to accept that the British had the right then to impose this. So it's like cheaper tea on one hand, but then you are accepting that colonists have the power to tax you in this way. So this is a pickle indeed. Everyone likes things that are, a little cheaper, but then you have to accept that at the same time. There's always these strings attached, right? And so colonists are looking at the Tea Act as another example of this taxation without representation. And this is something that they have been opposing since really the Stamp Act in 1765. And this resentment is going to culminate then in acts of defiance, including, of course, the infamous Boston Tea Party in 1773, when American patriots disguised as Native Americans dumped 342 chests of British tea into the Boston Harbor. And this act is a direct response to what they saw as overreach and imposition on their economic freedom. Now, the response to this is not uniform in the colonies. We see people like John Adams saying the destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible, and it must have so important consequences and so lasting. But I can't help but consider it as an epoch in history. But Benjamin Franklin said, I am truly concerned, as I believe all considerate men are with you, that there should seem to be any necessity for carrying matters to such an extremity, as in the dispute about public rights to destroy private property. This is about almost $2 million worth of things that are damaged. And this is a huge debate then. Should we be able to destroy private property in order to make a point about something? And I would say this is something that is still being debated here today. So Boston is not the only city in America to have to decide to do with the tea, but it is the only one that has this destruction in such a public and I would say like performative kind of manner. It's they also go to places like Philadelphia, where they threaten to tar and feather the captain of a ship carrying British tea. They end up kind of like sailing away. In South Carolina, it's not destroyed outright, but still we see that this is the one city that kind of makes a bold choice. And although it's controversial, we'll see then what happens. And by the way, in response to the Tea Act, many people decide to actually boycott tea. And they are going to turn to alternatives like these herbal teas that they make themselves from local plants. And I have to just say, they were made out of raspberry leaves and sage and mint. And although it sounds kind of maybe lovely now, it was very much seen as a huge sacrifice to have to do this. And sometimes you would even still buy like tea and then just say it was actually smuggled, or you would say that you made it because you just can't give it up. So it's really interesting to see how people kind of skirt around these economic issues and still then consume it. So this is where we are in 1774, which I'm sure you're all wondering, when will she ever get to 1774? So in response to the Tea Party, the British government said, hardline here, this is it. This is it. We need to squash this growing spirit of rebellion. And so they are going to enact these punitive measures. This is known as the Coercive Acts in England, but it's going to be known as the Intolerable Acts by the colonists. Among these, it's going to be the Boston Port Act. And this is very rather severe, I would say, and immediate and far-reaching consequences. So this is passed in March, although it does not reach the colonies until about like early May. By the time that they're going to really like get it, it takes about a month, sometimes even longer, depending on weather. We see right now, like think about like currently right now, there's a hurricane going in the Caribbean. Those kind of things have massive impact on how long it takes news to get across back and forth. So it is designed to punish the good people of Boston for the Tea Party and to restore order and to perhaps then quarantine the spirit of rebellion. It is going to mandate the complete closure of Boston Harbor to all ships and trade until the East India Company had been compensated and until really they're satisfied that order has been restored. So the harbor is the lifeblood of the economy, right? Especially in a city like Boston. And it's going to be completely sealed off as of June in 1774. No ships could enter or leave, and this cripples the city's trade and plunges the city into economic distress. And this is not, this is like wide reaching. This is going to be fishermen, dock workers, artisans. People are just out of work then. And there's going to be then a shortage of really essential goods. So we see here in this image, that is a British image called the Able Doctor. And many of us may be aware and have seen this image before. And so what is happening in this image? Well, we see then America is the one that's getting kind of held down then. And America has often been depicted as a Native American. We start seeing it depicted, America in British prints, as a female Native American, starting really in the Stamp Act. That's when we start seeing that shift from just being a Native American, typically a male Native American, to a female Native American. And from 1765 on, America is often depicted as that. And then we'll see with early Republic kind of other shifting in like the ways America is depicted. But this being America is being held down by Lord Mansfield, who's in the judge's wig and robes, while Lord North is holding her by the throat and pouring contents of a teapot down her mouth, force feeding. And America is ejecting this kind of in this stream directed back at Lord North's face. And from the pocket of Lord North, we see the Boston Port Bell. Over the peeping Tom is Sandwich, who is seen as kind of a letterer - rake as well, and lifting up and peering in there. Behind Mansfield is Lord Bute, who's in a Scots cap and killed holding a drawn sword that says military law. Behind America then is Britannia, kind of covering her eyes. And then to the left, we see a French and a Spanish like personification then, kind of wondering what's going on the sidelines, kind of like what's happening here. And so we kind of see then that the Boston Harbor is closed off, Boston cannonaded. So this is the way that people are kind of visualizing what's happened here. Another image as well visualizing the Boston Port Act is this one here called The Bostonians in Distress. So we see this kind of liberty tree, and we know that these people are from Boston because they're dressed up like Puritans, so that's often associated with Boston. And so others are then feeding. They're feeding Bostonians in distress with this fish. And that's kind of like the last part of our story here, because it's supposed to quarantine Boston, but this is then not going to happen so much. In a remarkable display of solidarity, other colonies then rally to Boston's support. They're going to send food and supplies and funds to help the city. And so this is a statement. It's not only a charity, but it's also a statement of support. And instead of dividing the colonies, in many ways, this brings them together, because and this is opposite of what Great Britain intends, of course, rather than breaking the spirit of the colonies, it becomes like a rallying point for resistance. And it's going to show, okay, if the British can do this to Boston, they can do this to any of us. And so for many, this is going to grow the sentiment that perhaps independence could be a viable option. So we're seeing this in 1774. We're seeing how they're coming together then. And so that is our first of the intolerable acts. And let's see how the others then play out in the colonies as well. Dr. Frawley.
See here. All right. All right. Thank you, Dr. Northrop. Oh, are you controlling it, Jen? Dr. Bridges? Did you hit that button?
I just gave you control, but I can do it if I need be.
Okay, perfect. I got it. I don't know, it moved. Okay. All right. So again, thank you, Dr. Northrop, and thanks everyone for coming out today for this talk. So as Dr. Northrop said, there's a lot of background here with the colonial wars for empire, excessive debt, and then the British wanting to impose new taxes to have the colonies help pay down much of that debt. And also the feeling of the colonists that, the British are changing the rules on them, or at least the patriot side of the colonists, that the British are suddenly changing the rules. They are moving away from what is referred to sometimes as salutary neglect, where there were these rules, but the British weren't really enforcing them, right? We have Jamestown founded in the early 1600s. So, for 150 plus years, there have been things like the Navigation Acts and other rules that are on the books, but the British aren't really enforcing those. And now they're going to start enforcing those, in reaction to these colonial wars for empire, most especially the French and Indian War. There's this sort of attitude that it's time, we need to reset. We need to sort of recalibrate our relationship with the colonies, and they need to help pay their fair share. And in reaction to the Boston Tea Party, you have King George III, who some of the columnists felt was not the one behind all this. They often sort of blamed Parliament for these changes, but this was done with George III's blessing. But George III is said to have made the comment that the colonies must either submit or triumph. And King George III has a meeting with General Thomas Gage, who had been in the colonies previously. He had been in the colonies for Pontiac's Rebellion. He had been in the colonies for the Boston Massacre. He was not present for the Boston Tea Party. He was on leave at that time. But he's going to have a meeting with King George III and Prime Minister Frederick North. And King George III is going to advocate for a more forceful reaction in response to the Boston Tea Party. And Lord North, Prime Minister Frederick North, who oversaw the Tea Act, is going to have the following statement. He says, quote, "We are not entering into a dispute between internal and external taxes, nor between taxes laid for the purpose of revenues or taxes laid for the regulation of trade, nor between representation and taxation," right? The sort of the slogan of the American Revolution would be no taxation without representation. But Lord North here is saying this is not what this is ultimately about. He says we are now in a dispute of whether we have or have not any authority in that country, right? And so this comes down to a question of power and a question of control. And so as Dr. Northrop discussed, we see these coercive acts are going to be passed, the first of which is the Boston Port Act. And that's going to go into be in full effect by the summer of 1774. The second of the coercive acts is going to be the Massachusetts Government Act. So Massachusetts, right? The focus here is on Boston. One of the sort of mistakes you might say that Britain is making in all of this is they're it's almost like they have blinders on. There's some sort of geographic determinism going on here. They're focused almost exclusively on Boston and Massachusetts, ignoring some things going on in some of the other colonies. But Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had been founded back in 1630, but in 1691, Britain had consolidated a number of colonies like Plymouth Colony, which was founded in 1620, Massachusetts Bay Colony, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, a series of others, Maine, had been consolidated into the province of Massachusetts under sort of a single colonial government. And again, this was in 1691. Well, on May 20th, 1774, Britain is going to institute the Massachusetts Government Act, which is going to repeal that colonial charter. And that is an unprecedented move. Britain had never done this before, but they're going to repeal the colonial charter of Massachusetts, and they are going to sort of hand control over to the royal government, and in a way, it's almost as if they're going to declare what we might call martial law or military rule. And the reason I say that is the new royal governor that is going to be selected by the crown to take control of Massachusetts is aforementioned General Thomas Gage, you see in the picture here. So General Thomas Gage, who I said had been on leave during the Boston Tea Party, is now back in America. He has 10,000 troops at his, I think it's 10,000, I may be misremembering the number there, but he's got thousands of troops under his command in Boston to enforce these coercive acts. The Executive Council of the Colony of Massachusetts is no longer elected. It will now be appointed by this royal governor or this military governor. He will also appoint and dismiss other civil offices, including judges for the colony, the attorney general, provosts, marshals, justices of the peace, sheriffs. The sheriffs will now select juries for jury trials as opposed to landholders who used to appoint the juries. So again, this is a sign of more royal control of this colony. Town meetings are also banned without the consent of the royal governor, Thomas Gage. So town meetings can no longer take place without his consent. And sort of some of the language from this actual act states that whereas a great abuse has been made of the power of calling such meetings, and the inhabitants have, contrary to the designs of their institutions, been misled to treat upon matters of the most general concern and to pass dangerous and unwarrantable resolves, for the remedy thereof, no meeting shall be called without the leave of the governor. So no more colonial meetings. And Prime Minister Frederick North stated that this was meant to take the executive power from the hands of the democratic part of the government, right? And so again, this is about control. So in October, just fast forward for a moment, in October of 1774, Thomas Gage is going to enforce the aspect of the Massachusetts Government Act that bans meetings, and so he is going to dissolve the provincial assembly, which at that time was meeting in Salem, Massachusetts, and so that the reaction of these separatists or the patriot cause, the reaction to that will be they will adjourn. They will disregard the law. They're not going to accept this. They're going to adjourn, and they're going to set up a new meeting in Concord, Massachusetts, which if you fast forward, a year from now, we're going to see the start of the actual revolution at the battles of Lexington and Concord. So they're going to establish their new government at Concord with John Hancock as their president. Thus, they only recognize Thomas Gage being in charge of the city of Boston proper because he has the soldiers there, but they're in charge of the rest of Massachusetts. And once the British evacuate Boston, again next year, this new government of Massachusetts will be in charge until the Massachusetts state government is established with their constitution in 1780. I don't see the little fours, so if you wouldn't mind, Dr. Bridges. Yeah, it's not showing up on my screen. There we go. Okay, the third of the coercive acts is the Administration of Justice Act. So this goes into effect the same day as the Massachusetts Government Act, and this is the Administration of Justice Act, or officially known as an Act for the Impartial Administration of Justice. And that term impartial is key here. There were concerns in Britain that royal officials representing the crown in the colonies could not get they were concerned that royal officials would be discouraged from the proper discharge of their duties to enforce laws and suppress quote unquote riots and tumults. Think back to the Boston Tea Party or maybe farther back to the Boston Massacre. But they just thought that royal officials would be discouraged from enforcing the laws, carrying out punishments and what have you, due to a quote, an apprehension that they may be liable to be brought to trial before persons who do not acknowledge the validity of the law, end quote. And so this concern that they won't get a fair trial. And so what the Administration of Justice Act does is it allows the royal governor, again, General Thomas Gage, the military governor, to institute a change of venue for any trial involving a royal official, especially if it involves any kind of a capital crime. Someone's killed while maybe they're trying to enforce the law or trying to suppress a riot. But any royal official that is charged with a crime they could either change the venue to another colony where they felt they might get a fairer trial, or they could actually change the venue to Britain proper, overseas, to have the trial there. Now, the act also stipulated that to ensure that the trial was fair, if you're looking at it from the British perspective, to ensure the trial is fair, Britain agreed that they would compensate witnesses on both sides, witnesses that would sort of support the British side of things and the witnesses that might support the Patriot side of things. But they would pay the expenses for that witness to go to the trial, to attend the trial. Because if they didn't do that, of course, then the witnesses aren't going to go. They're not going to be able to do it. But there was some confusion on the colonial side about, well, what would represent fair compensation? If you've ever had jury duty before, right? We're compensated for jury duty. Is that fair compensation? Are we paid our salaries, or what constitutes fair compensation? And the colonists were also concerned about, okay, you say you'll compensate us to travel to the trial, but are you going to compensate me for missed work? Are you going to compensate me for my inability to bring in my crop, or whatever the case may be? And so the colonists, at least the sort of the Whig colonists, the separatist colonists, the patriot colonists, they see this as unfair, that this will not result in fair trials, because again, witnesses probably aren't going to be able to go because they're not going to miss work. They're not going to miss bringing in the crops. They're not going to miss whatever. They're not going to travel for this. And so it's not going to result in a fair trial. In fact, some colonists, including future President George Washington, referred to the Administration of Justice Act as the Murder Act, arguing that this would allow sort of royal representatives to get away with murder, if you will. And they would point out also that, hey, didn't the soldiers who were accused of the Boston Massacre, didn't they get a fair trial? John Adams represented them. Most of them were acquitted. A few were charged with lesser crimes or found guilty of lesser crimes. But there was evidence that they could point to and say, look, there was a fair trial. So again, the colonists largely see this as unfair. The Administration of Justice Act as being unfair, as a tool of oppression. Next slide, please. Okay. The fourth of the coercive acts is the Quartering Act of 1774. Now, you'll notice in the picture here, British soldiers quartered in an American colonial home, and it says circa 1770. And you might think, wait a minute, did Dr. Frawley invent, a time machine as he jump in his DeLorean and hit 88 miles per hour? That's before the Quartering Act of 1774. And that's because I couldn't find any good art for 1774. But what this is depicting, the 1770 piece of art, is the prior Quartering Act of 1765. So Dr. Northrop had mentioned the French and Indian War, and then I briefly mentioned Pontiac's Rebellion. And so as the British is having to send military forces over to the colonies to fight in these colonial wars for empire and to put down Pontiac's Rebellion, one of the generals that was overseeing this is General Thomas Gage, who we've seen before. And Gage complained to Britain that the colonies are not providing quarter, housing, foodstuffs for the soldiers, and they need to help. And so back in 1765, Britain had instituted, under the Grenville Plan, had instituted the first Quartering Act of 1765, which allowed, if no barracks were available, it allowed British officers to quarter their soldiers in, quote, inns, livery stables, ale houses, victualling houses, houses of sellers of wine, houses of persons selling rum, brandy, strong water, cider, and mead. So basically places of business. So it allowed the quartering of soldiers in places of business. And that Quartering Act was very unpopular among the colonists, and it expired in 1767. Well, it's back. Here we are in 1774. Thomas Gage is back now as the royal governor of Massachusetts and Boston with his soldiers. They're going to reinstitute the Quartering Act, but they're not going to expand its use. In 1774, it will expand to, quote unquote, uninhabited houses, outhouses, barns, and other buildings, as the governor shall think necessary to take. Now, you have at the front of that quote, uninhabited houses. So there's this attitude that this artist depiction shows British soldiers coming into an occupied home, of course, but according to the letter of the law, it should be uninhabited houses. But then it closes with that statement of any other buildings that the governor shall think necessary to take. And so there is a debate about whether any occupied houses were ever used for quarter, but it was certainly still unpopular because now you've moved it to the occupation of personal property, whether it's inhabited or not. And so again, many of the separatists, many of the Whigs, the Patriots, call them what you will, viewed this as a tool of oppression. There has been a long-standing, even prior to this, a long-standing fear of standing armies throughout Western history. You can look back to the days of the Greek, the Greek poli, when there were times when it was deemed important for a tyrant to take over. You can look back to issues with the Roman Republic and stories about Cincinnatus and others. But there's this sort of long-standing concern that standing armies can represent impediments to freedom, right? That they can be tools of oppression. That Benjamin Franklin in a document he would write next year in 1775, in talking about things like the Quartering Act, would say that, quote, "They who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." And there's this concern about these occupying armies, right? They're there for your safety, right? We're having to keep these troops here from the British perspective to protect you, right? To protect you from the Indians of the frontier, to maybe in the French and Indian War, to protect you from the French up in Canada, maybe to protect you from yourselves, right? You're misbehaving, and we need to be there as a means of protection. But again, many of the colonists are going to view this as, this isn't about protection, this is about power, this is about oppression. And so they are going to protest against this. And sort of, again, looking to the future a bit, we're going to see this codified in our Constitution, right? In the Bill of Rights. We have the Third Amendment to the Constitution, which dictates that no soldier shall, in a time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in a time of war, but in manner to be prescribed by law. Right. So we have it codified in our Constitution that this sort of thing can't happen during peacetime, and during wartime, there would have to be special laws passed for this to go into effect. Others have also pointed to the Quartering Act as justification for the Second Amendment, right? The right to bear arms against a tyrannical government, this concern about a tyrannical government or a government that might oppress, and the people being able to protect themselves. And so this, again, was another of these unpopular acts. So these are our 4 coercive acts, right? The Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Administration of Justice Act, and the Quartering Act. And these are all in the summer of 1774. But we're going to get another act, if you'll go to the next slide, please. That same summer, and see, June of 1774, and this is the Quebec Act. Now, from the British perspective, this is unrelated. This has nothing to do with the Boston Tea Party. This doesn't have anything to do with trying to recalibrate the relationship with Massachusetts or the 13 British colonies. This is about something separate. This is about dealing with some lingering issues left over from the French Indian War. But from the colonial perspective, it is related, right? The timing is suspicious. And so they're going to lump this one together. So we've got our four coercive acts. I'm looking at my camera here. And then we have this Quebec Act. And those 5 together are what the colonists are going to refer to as the intolerable acts. So what is the Quebec Act? Well, if you look back to the French Indian War, the French Indian War originated because the colony of Virginia, led by Governor Robert Dinwiddie, who was also a stakeholder in the Ohio River Company, wanted to sort of ensure control of the Ohio River Valley. And so we're going to see Virginia militia sent out to the Ohio River Valley. Well, the problem there is the French also claim they control the Ohio River Valley. And so fighting is going to erupt, and we're going to get the French Indian War. Ultimately, the British are going to win that war. And so they're going to get control of the Ohio River Valley, basically control of everything up to the Mississippi River. And the colonists are happy about that. But then Britain is going to pass a proclamation of 1763, which says, well, yes, we control everything to the Mississippi River, but you colonists, you can't go out there. You can't go to the Ohio River. You have to stop at the Appalachian Mountains. We don't want you going out there agitating our new French subjects, because, again, all the French people didn't leave when the war was lost. There's still French people there, but they're just now under British authority. And we don't want you going out there agitating the American Indians that live out there, many of whom allied with the French. And so what do the colonists do? They cross the line anyway, and they instigate problems. And so the colonists come to feel that, look, we fought this war, we fought and died in this war, and now you're telling us we can't go out there to the Ohio River Valley, and that's what we fought for. And this harkens back to some other issues from the colonial wars for empire, which every time a treaty was signed in those wars, it always ended with this concept of status quo ante bellum, which is a Latin phrase that means the way things were before the war, which the colonists viewed as, okay, so we're fighting and dying in these wars, but at the end of them, you're just telling us it has to go back to the way it used to be. So does Britain really even care about our sacrifices? Do they care about the cause for which we thought we were fighting for? So fast forward to 1774, Britain is still trying to deal with, okay, what about these French people who are now our subjects, right? We defeated France in the French Indian War, but now there's all these French people that live in Canada, and we need to see about them. And so what the Quebec Act did is it stretched the boundaries of the province, the former French province of Quebec, all the way down to the Ohio River. So you can see the dark line of the Ohio River and then up the Mississippi River. In fact, if you'll go to the next slide, there's I think I have a better map. Thank you. So you see on the left map there, that's the province of Quebec. It goes roughly down to the Ottawa River, which is that white line you see at the bottom of the pink area. Well, now with the Quebec Act of 1774, you see how much larger the province of Quebec is going to be, and it goes all the way down into modern Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, parts of Minnesota, down to the Ohio River Valley. And so it's basically telling the French people of British Canada, you can now go down and settle in that region. And so again, the colonists are thinking, wait a minute, we fought a war that ended in 1763 because we wanted to go to that region. You told us we couldn't go to that region, and now you're telling our former enemies they can go settle in that region, right? And so that's not very popular. Sort of a replay almost of the status quo antebellum. And then the Quebec Act also removed Protestantism, the mention of Protestantism from the oath of allegiance that Quebec's royal officials would have to take. When they took their oath of allegiance, they would not have to swear allegiance to the Anglican Church or to the Protestant faith. And again, the French are predominantly Catholic. And so this is going to allow Catholics to serve in government positions in the province of Quebec, the British province of Quebec. And that was very unpopular because another long tradition in American history is anti-papism, anti-Catholicism, anti-popery. It's not even that old, right? You can look back. It hasn't come, President Joe Biden is Catholic, hasn't come up quite as much with him. But if you look back to President John F. Kennedy, there was a big issue with him being Catholic, and that was used against him during the election in the 1960s. So anti-papism is very old. This concern about if you're Catholic, is your loyalty to the government or is your loyalty to the Pope and these sorts of things. And so there was a lot of anti-papism. They didn't like that Catholicism was tolerated in Quebec. The Quebec Act also reinstituted many aspects of French law when it came to property and civil rights. And so, again, if you look to our Declaration of Independence, one of the grievances that the colonists, the patriots, the separatists would have against King George III is they would be angry at him, quote, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, right, talking about Quebec, and establishing therein arbitrary government and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, right? And so there were concerns about this Quebec Act. And so last slide for me. Next one, please. And so to build off of one of Dr. Northrop's slides, she showed the image of the able doctor, right? And she talked, it was sort of a political cartoon of the era. And she mentioned Lord North being in the background and Lord Bute in the background. Well, this is what's called the mitered minuet. And so in this piece of art that was in a London magazine and it's housed in the British Museum, you see in the middle there, Lord North pointing at the mitered Catholic leaders, right? The mitre is the hat that they wear. It's a symbol of their authority. Pointing at them, there's Lord Bute next to him. The other figure next to him is unidentified. And then notice over their shoulders, kind of looking on, is Satan himself, right? The devil looking on as these papists, these Catholics are dancing a minuet, right? They're dancing around the Quebec Bill, right? And so these four coercive acts plus the Quebec Act come to us as the intolerable acts, and we will see what the ultimate response of all of this is from Dr. Lundberg.
All right, thank you. See what happened to my camera there? Oh, there I am. Okay, so can you all hear me? Volume
Yes.
okay? Good. Okay, great. So ultimately, the outcome of the Intolerable Acts was the organization of the First Continental Congress. After the coercive or the Intolerable Acts, across North America, goods began pouring into Boston from as far away as Georgia. The Virginia Committee of Correspondence is generally given credit for calling for an invitation for a Continental Congress to meet in Philadelphia. The delegates were elected in a variety of ways. Some were elected through their respective colonial legislatures, some through their committees of correspondence. Georgia was the only colony that did not send delegates because they were in a war with Native Americans at the time and feared the loss of British support. And so there are also a lot of loyalists in Georgia. Again, loyalties are still pretty evenly split at this time. There's a lot that favor retribution against Britain, but there's also a lot of hesitance, so there is conflict between loyalists and rebels. But there were 56 delegates ultimately that attended the First Continental Congress. Among them, George Washington, Samuel Adams, John Adams. There was disagreement about their goals among many of the delegates at first. What exactly are they trying to accomplish? But one of the first things they did was they adopted the Suffolk Resolves. The Suffolk Resolves had initially been adopted by Suffolk County, Massachusetts, to urge resistance against the Intolerable Acts. And so the Suffolk Resolves were to urged to refuse. Well, if I could talk, it would be better. The Suffolk Resolves urged banning British goods, banning the importation of British goods, or raising militia. So the early endorsement of this was a pretty clear indication of where the Congress stood, where the majority of the Congress stood. And again, they're meeting in Carpenter's Hall, which is today located at 320 Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. So if you ever want to visit, that is a National Historic Landmark. But the delegates also began drafting and discussing the Continental Association. And the Continental Association is probably their most important policy outcome. It called for an end to British imports starting in December of 1774. And an end to exporting goods to Great Britain in September 1775. These bans would be enforced by colony-wide committees of inspection. The committees would check those ships that were coming into ports for British goods. And ultimately, the Declaration of Resolves was the second major thing to come out of the Continental Congress. And again, they only met from September 5th to October 26, 1774, so it's a relatively brief time. But the Declaration of Resolves, as of December 1st, 1774, that's when they banned British goods coming into the colonies, and planned for the banning of exports to Great Britain as well. And then finally, the third, if the Suffolk Resolves were the first major important thing the Continental Congress did, and the Declaration of Resolves were the second major thing they did, the third and final was, and perhaps most consequential, was calling for a second Continental Congress to meet the next year. And so here we're setting the table for a revolution here even further, because now the colonies have determined to wage an economic war on Great Britain, a war to ban British imports and ban exports to Great Britain. And so the First Continental Congress was one of these pivotal moments that, every colony was there except Georgia. And again, Georgia, there's a lot of loyalists, plus they're in the middle of a war with Native American tribes there. And so they fear the loss of British governmental support in their war. But, other than that, the colonies are united for one of the first times They discuss. There are discussions of a colonial-wide union that never come to fruition during the First Continental Congress, but it is a very important first step. And there you can see Carpenter's Hall. So again, that's really all that I have.
Thank you, Dr. Lundberg. So now we're going to go into some questions that many of us might have, and we'll bring everyone onto the screen. This is a new feature we have, so I'm kind of excited about it. So any questions that you that the audience may have, they can put here in the Q&A box. And we will also be posting for everybody the attendance link as well, because I know that those who are here would love to get that extra credit. So my question is, when we're thinking about this in relation to, let's say, 1776, many of us are going to be celebrating the 4th of July tomorrow, and perhaps, celebrating with our friends and family and the fireworks and cookouts and all of that. So what impact do we think the things that happened in 1774 then have, maybe directly or even indirectly then, to what's going to be happening in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence? And I think, Dr. Frawley, you brought up that a lot. I really enjoyed those links that you made, kind of some of those direct links then between what's happening here and now. Are there any other things that maybe come to mind? And Dr. Bridges, Dr. Lundberg, anyone feel free. Any other connections that we see that come to mind that have maybe a direct impact if we're thinking about the legacy of 1774 and looking maybe forward towards 1776?
Yeah, if you look at, I mean, I just brought it up on my other screen, but if you look at the Declaration of Independence and you look down through the grievances that were listed, I mean, it's a laundry list of what we just went over. It's not, I mean, they're not specifically named, but the Quartering Act is in there. The Quebec Act is in there. All of them are in there. The Massachusetts Government Act, criticizing the king for dissolving governments, etc. But I also think it's important to point out that we often, when we're looking back at history, we often see things as having been inevitable, right? It's easy for us to do that because we're just like, well, it happened, so this is everything that led to that. But it is important to remember that not all Americans, not all the colonists supported the Whig side of things. There were a lot of Tory advocates, the loyalists, right? Georgia didn't send a representative to the First Continental Congress, largely because of the work of Governor James Wright, who was the colonial governor of Georgia at the time, very loyal governor, very popular among his fellow Georgians. And so, sometimes people think Georgia didn't go because they were far away. It's my home state, so I gotta talk about it for a minute. But they're far away. And it was more than that. It was that their governor played a role in discouraging their attendance. And so I think it is important to note that not everybody supported this cause, and it's sort of, I think it grows. The number of colonists that support it, I think, does grow the closer you get to the revolution, but it's not unanimous. There's none of our wars in our nation's history have ever been sort of unanimously supported. So just acknowledging the other side of the equation.
Yes, and I think that was something that I really enjoyed from the Mary Beth Norton book. I feel like it's kind of almost like we could have a book club right now about how we felt about the book since we read this before. But it's really interesting, I think, to take one. But here, we can all hold up our copies of it. And mine, by the way, mine is an audiobook, and I am continually having conversations about whether or not that's a real book. So that's another thing that we can talk about. But I really liked about it is showing the division, even within families, that they had about how to respond to some of these acts. And it wasn't unified. I think when we look back, it's so easy to think about this being kind of a unified moment and that everyone felt the same way about everything. And it's good to show the nuance of it. And I think that that's important for us even nowadays today, because how will we look back at our time, maybe that we're living in now, and will maybe everyone be lumped into some kind of group? And is that really fair? But it does kind of obviously simplify things when we're thinking about looking back at a year like this. But I really do love that even within families, how to respond to these things, it is very contentious. And another thing that I enjoyed about this book is thinking about the importance of the Caribbean and the empire. That's what I focus on specifically. And so She brought up a lot about places like St. Eustatius, which was an island where a lot of smuggling happened. And so that's what they would call it, like the Dutch tea, to show that it had been smuggled from this island. And I really loved thinking about kind of the wider ramifications, that the things that were happening aren't just affecting, the 13 colonies that do separate, but that the British Empire as a whole. And I love thinking about that, especially as we're kind of marching. And each year as we're getting, if we look at 1775, next year, 1776, thinking about the larger ramifications for people on the peripheries, if we will, of the empire. That's why I loved you talking about the Quebec Act more, because that's something that happens that does have a massive effect. And we're thinking about like French still being kind of like spoken in this area. There's something that happened then that still maybe has ramifications still today. So I really love thinking about that as we are looking at, this 250 year thing. So, I see something. Oh, Brad, I'm so sorry. If you are in this chat here now, we cannot unmute your mic. We are with the town hall. You'll have to put it in the Q&A. And so sorry about that. We are still learning our town hall. That's what this is. We used to do MS Teams Live, and that's what this is. So if you do have a question, please put it in there. Any other kind of thoughts from our speakers here today as we've kind of looked at this year? Anything that you might have learned from doing kind of your research? We all lecture about this, by the way, in our History 1301 class, but for many of us, we had to do kind of a deeper dive to think about some of these things and expand it from what we traditionally did. So anything that you learned or that you found interesting from doing this?
So I'll just close. I mean, the last thing I want to put out there, and it's not necessarily something I learned fresh, but something I always think about this time of year as we're commemorating Independence Day, is two things. One is when you're reflecting on what becomes the American Revolution, it's actually an assignment that my students have. My students are in here. Here's you can borrow this for your discussion later. But was what's going to happen conservative or is it revolutionary? Right? We call it the American Revolution, but some people object to that term. They prefer to call it the War for American Independence because they would argue that the Patriot cause was conservative, not to use modern term conservative, not that, but just conservative in the sense that they had grown accustomed to a way of life over the course of 150 plus years, and they were trying to keep that. They saw the British as the ones trying to change the rules. And so they were trying to maintain what they viewed as the status quo. And so I think that's just something to think about. Was it conservative? Obviously, it was revolutionary in the sense that it led to a new form of government, right? We moved from a constitutional monarchy to a constitutional republic. That's clearly revolutionary. But on a more sort of philosophical level, was it revolutionary or was it really a conservative reaction? And then the other thing I think that's even more important to think about for all Americans and all people really is, Dr. Lundberg talked about this declaration of or this resolve, this declaration of rights and what have you, and that's issued at the First Continental Congress. And it's just worth considering, where do we get off thinking we have rights? It's just something that I think we should all ponder at times. Like, where do those come from? Like, do we, obviously the founders are going to be influenced largely by the philosophy of the Enlightenment, the writings of people like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Charles Montesquieu and that sort of thing. But they're also influenced by Judeo-Christian belief. And just so this idea that they're gonna list out, we have rights, and here we're rights as Englishmen. Why do you think you have those rights? And why do you, as a person living in the 21st century, I'm pretty sure we all think we have some rights. Like, why do you think you have those? And I think that's a profound question to reflect upon, especially this time of year. So I'll just leave it at that.
I'd love to say something on that because I've thought about that a lot too, and I talk about when I lecture this the importance of precedence in the way we view rights, because people do, when you just get used to something being a certain way, even if it's not a formal law or protection, but it's just the way of life you get used to. The precedent gets set, and precedents become rights, at least in the way we view them, right, over time, and that's why precedence is so important, actually. Because people do start to see that as right with time. And I think we definitely see that when it comes to that period of salutary neglect, and the colonists starting to see things as rights, even if they weren't, technically protected rights, but they start to view it that way because for so long it was a certain way, right? And so it becomes this understanding of a right. But you're absolutely correct in that. But what is a right, and do we actually have them, and how does it work? And what makes us think that way? And it's really interesting to contemplate the idea of that. So totally. We actually have a new question, guys, in our Q&A. Do the presenters think that our modern celebrations of July 4th are reflective of this history, or more so just seen as a day off for grilling poolside time? And how can we more clearly connect to this shared past? If anyone wants to take that one on.
I think it's interesting is apparently Providence celebrated yesterday because they think that it really should be July 2. And I just love that they're like, hey, you know what? We're going to like kick it old school and we're going to do the correct day. And so apparently they had like the fireworks and everything yesterday. And I actually really love that because I feel like it's a way to show July 4. Yes, it is the day that goes down, but we're gonna actually like be like more true to when everyone like signs and everything in the day that John Adams yesterday.
I was gonna say, can you explain to the audience what you
mean by
that?
So that's the day that most people actually sign, and like John Adams, and many people like write down like this is the day that goes down, right? And so I love that they're like, we're going to stick with that. And I personally love when I have people over to our pool to share more about the 4th of July with them. And for me, I say it's one thing to declare independence. It's another thing to actually win it. And I feel like we should also like pay homage to like signing the treaties afterwards and what that actually means. And then again, everyone tells me like, nobody wants to hear this. Just go eat your corn. Like, just, and I do try though and say like, you can declare anything. And I always think about, I don't know if you have any Office fans in here, but when Michael Scott says, I declare bankruptcy, when he like just declares in the office because he doesn't have any money. And then I always kind of laugh about that because I think, it's one thing to declare anything, but it's actually another thing to do it and to prove it. And I know, like, don't get me wrong, I know it's important to do that, but it's also important to actually fight the war and win it. And that's something that's going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of sacrifice and a lot of help from the French, which I have a whole nother conversation that I would like to talk about that in a larger like thought in the as we're moving forward in these years here. But I think it would be great, and I hope maybe after everyone who's here at this presentation today will go to their family cookouts and chat and say like, let's talk. Should we celebrate this today? And what does this mean for us? And go and see if your family too will tell you just like go eat your whatever. Yeah.
I think the question Misty asked, I think could be applied to any holiday.
True.
When you're celebrating, when you're ripping open your Christmas presents, what are you really thinking about? So anyway, I think it depends on the family and the individual on that. But yeah, just opening the conversation, like Dr. Northrop said.
Yeah, and then come back and tell us how it went over. And I hope that it goes. Maybe your friends are like more like deep thinkers and are more excited about having these conversations.
Yeah, usually historians, we're kind of people don't really want to get us going at July 4th celebrations or many other celebrations for that matter, because we tend to just throw a wet blanket on what everyone likes to believe.
Don't watch
happened.
Movies with us ever.
Yeah. Oh no, don't watch The Patriot with me. God, I mean, y'all probably don't even know what that is anymore. But yeah, don't watch it with me.
But if you do watch The Patriot, think about Heath Ledger because he is like fabulous in the movie. But again, yes, that's a side thing, for sure. Another conversation, and maybe we should have that could be one of our movie discussions coming up too as well. All right. Well, thank everybody. Thank you all for being here today. And thank you for these really great presentations. I know it's a lot for us to think about going forward. And I hope we do have a lovely celebration and a day off tomorrow. For many people, it's an extra long weekend. So good for that. If you're in my class, it is not. You still have things to do coming up this weekend. So definitely take a little break, but keep that course calendar open on Canvas.
Welcome to online summer.
Yes, and make sure that you're still turning in your assignments and communicating and everything. So thank you so much, Dr. Lundberg, Dr. Bridges, and Dr. Frawley for this conversation today, and a lot for us all to think about and to go and as we go forward today. So stay tuned for more events to come. Please look in that Q&A for the link for the attendance form. I posted it. It says 12 minutes ago. So click on that and tell us you were here today and give us some feedback. And if you weren't able to see this live, it is going to be recorded and posted as well. So have a great day, everybody, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.